rallying for a white resentment towards your supporters. But in effect, as you pointed out, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, the Confederate flags, they're coming down. And in and of itself, each of these symbols may not have been a big ideal, but together they present a backwards-looking, irrelevant picture of this country, and people are fed up. And in addition to these symbols, people are going to start confronting Trump on the actual policies that constitute racial equality in this country, from policing reform to a fair, equitable, transparent distribution of the COVID recovery resources, and a whole bunch of other policy issues. So we'll see if it works for him, but not likely.
Can you empathize, though, Rich, with the people who see all of this sudden seismic cultural change and think, the whole world that I thought I knew is changing, and I don't know which way is up right now? These symbols were fine, and then they weren't. The statue was no problem, and now it's a problem. Are you empathetic to that perspective, that kind of shock to the system?
No, I'm not, Joshua. And the reason I'm not is because I've traveled this country for my research and for my reporting. And I would go to places like Ohio and Indiana and Oregon, and I'd see these young white kids with Confederate flags all over their paraphernalia, and nary a one of them had any ties to the Confederate generals. Nary a one of them were Southerners. And so they've adopted this symbol to their own current white racial resentment. And so for them to call it a shock to the system is really cuckoo and a bit disingenuous, given that they have no ties to the Civil War themselves. They probably couldn't even name you any of the battles that the Confederate soldiers won during that time. I mean, what's their ties? So this idea that it's a shock to the system or that it represents something that they truly understand is kind of ludicrous. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen people fly these flags, have these flags all over. And if you ask them, you know, what battle did your grandfather fight in? They couldn't tell you because they have no relationship truly to the Confederate South.
Now, we mentioned that the president focused on Confederate statues in his speech. That's not all that's changing. We mentioned Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's rice. They're looking to evolve their brands. They, in particular, have been called out for the way that they've used black characters, or rather caricatures. Why did it take so long for big businesses to come around on these stereotypical brands?
I think it probably took so long because these stereotypes were seen as profitable and beneficial to these corporations. And I think with all these multiracial protests in more than 75 cities across the country, I think corporations have realized the tipping point and that it no longer serves them well. And I think in many cases, there's been an ethical change of mind where they said, aha, we regret having, contributed to this cultural or symbolic racism.
And I think it's important to note also that, if I saw, Ms. Jemima coming down the street, I wouldn't call her aunt. I would call her ma'am or miss. And that term aunt is a kind of a forced, unearned familiarity that was used as a diminutive to prevent black men and women from being treated like a Mr. or a Mrs., like a sir or a ma'am. You don't call a grown-up, out of his first name. You say sir, Mr. Smith, or whatever. So it's an inherently pejorative, diminutive use of language. You kind of refer to this idea of whiteness in an op-ed that you wrote for the LA Times. In part, it reads, quote, acting white in the true Republican sense means treating all people with tact and humility. You don't grovel before anyone. You don't tear them down. Your self-respect derives from honoring other people's. A Republican society is in service to all citizens, so a leader and the people's conduct is meant to be mutually uplifting. Corrupt, self-aggrandizing, selfish Trump is the opposite of Republican white acting. If whiteness were a brand, Trump is doing it severe, lasting damage, unquote. President Trump is damaging the brand of whiteness? Was it really riding so high before he showed up?
By the way, that Republican you're reading is a small R Republican.
I was going to ask you that. Thank you.
Of the Republican of the people. So if you consider that sense of whiteness then indeed Trump is doing it damage. And we see this. We see this seething resentment among the Lincoln Project, the Never Trumpers, who say, this is not America, this is not our party, and this is not what it means to be white. But he has this kind of rowdy, self-aggrandizing, corrupt, vulgar self-presentation. It's a performance of a certain type of whiteness that makes many white people's skin crawl.
I would love to have a longer conversation with you another day about that notion, that this is not what white people see in themselves. If that's the case, how did we get to this point? Conversation for another night. Rich Benjamin is the author of Searching for Whitopia. Rich, thanks very much.
Thanks, Joshua. Thank you.